Polyvagal theory, a science of safety. This is printed in Frontiers in Integrative Neuroscience, published May 10th, 2022, written by Dr. Stephen Porges. Part 2. Dissolution. Consistent with polyvagal theory, the sequencing of the hierarchy of neural maturation mirrors features of vertebrate evolution. The theory emphasizes the modifications in the neural regulation of the autonomic nervous system that is highlighted through phylogenetic transitions, especially the transition from asocial reptiles to the sociality and co-regulation features of social mammals. Operationally defining feelings of safety as dependent on an autonomic state provides an opportunity to study the potential emergent properties that are dependent on access to this state. Thus, it's proposed that the consequence of feeling safe provides the neural platform for cooperative behaviors, both supporting physiological systems and enabling accessibility to higher brain structures for learning, creativity, appreciation of aesthetics, and even spirituality. An acknowledgement of this hierarchy results in questions about the sequential unfolding of response to challenges orienting within the body, example, fever and illness, and outside the body, example, threat. Disease and injury to the brain have been observed to disinhibit phylogenetically more ancient evolutionary structures that in the healthy individual are regulated, example, inhibited, by newer brain structures. This was described by Jackson, who stated that the higher nervous arrangements inhibit or control the lower, and thus, when the higher are suddenly rendered functionless, the lower rise in activity. Jackson labeled this process dissolution to emphasize that it is evolution in reverse. While Jackson emphasized a dissolution process that mirrors the reverse of evolution in brain structures, moving from neocortex to lower brain structures, polyvagal theory emphasizes the reverse of evolution in the neural structures and pathways that regulate the mammalian autonomic nervous system. In this hierarchy of adaptive responses, the newest social engagement circuit is used first. If that circuit fails to provide safety, the older circuits are recruited sequentially. The elements of the social engagement system are functional at birth in the full-term infant and serve to enable infant and mother to co-regulate autonomic states via reciprocal cues of safety. The product of this co-regulation is the optimization of homeostatic functions, enabling the infant to mature and the mother to recover from the metabolically demanding delivery process. Early in life, this co-regulation provides the neurophysiological platform for mother-infant interactions and attachment, and the establishment of social bonds, which can be conceptualized as being dependent on associations with feelings of safety. Focusing on levels 1 and 2, we see that optimal behavior is dependent on neuroregulation of the autonomic nervous system and the connectivity between cortical areas, allowing the accurate interpretation of cues of safety and threat, and the brainstem areas regulating the autonomic nervous system. The quantification of respiratory sinus arrhythmia provides a quantitative portal into level 1, while the vagal efficiency metric would reflect level 2 competency. Autonomic state is an intervening variable. By placing autonomic state at the core of the feelings of safety or threat, the pragmatic survival behaviors of fight and flight, as well as complex problem-solving strategies that would lead to escape, are consequential and dependent on the facilitatory functions of the ANS in optimizing these strategies. Similarly, turning off threat reactions and calming autonomic state via the ventral cardioinhibitory vagal pathway will promote interpersonal accessibility, while simultaneously supporting the co-regulation of autonomic state. This model positions autonomic state as an intervening variable mediating the interpretation of contextual cues and shaping our reactions. Within this conceptualization, depending on the individual's autonomic state, the same contextual cues and challenges may result in different behavioral, cognitive, and physiological reactions. For example, recent research documents that indices of autonomic state influence the impact the pandemic on mental health, perceived stress in college students, effectiveness of neurostimulation on abdominal pain, calming behavior in infants following the still face procedure, and protest behaviors in infants in daycare centers. This would be true both within and between individuals, and thus there may be a range of reactions among individuals who share the same environmental context, but who are in different autonomic states. In addition, the same individual may also have a range of reacting to repeated exposures to the same environmental context that would be mediated by variations in autonomic state. PTSD symptoms may be the product of retuned autonomic nervous system following extreme and/or repeated exposures to threat. Research supports the conceptualization that the mental and physical health consequences of adversity are reflected in a retuned autonomic nervous system, locked into states of defense that limit an access to the common pathways through the ventral vagal associated with sociality. Acknowledging the important role of autonomic state as an intervening variable would have profound consequences on our understanding of behavior and the often faulty assumption that a behavior is intentional and reliably regulated by rewards and punishments. The model proposes that our cognitive intent and our bodily state can promote competing behavioral outcomes. As an observer of both behavior and autonomic state, my bet is on the potency of autonomic state. This conclusion is supported by the link between autonomic state and feelings of threat and our embedded biobehavioral program to survive. Since these states of defense are regulated by primitive neurocircuits, circuits which are shared by many more ancient vertebrates, intentional self-regulation efforts originating in the cortex are frequently ineffective in downregulating survival-driven reactions to threat, which are dependent on lower brain structures. The survival program is evolutionary old, while the program that turns off threat reactions with cues of safety to promote calmness, sociality, and homeostatic functions is a mammalian innovation of a repurposed autonomic nervous system. that may be influenced by higher brain structures. Although the calming system is effective in downregulating threat reactions in response to mild threats, it's difficult to access when the defensive systems are in highly activated survival mode. Functionally, we need to conceptualize the model as having both bottom-up and top-down pathways, with the bottom-up pathway being a combination of both reflexive and derivative of early evolutionary survival processes. The foundational are functionally hardwired via neuroception. Thus, although cues of safety or threat will trigger a top-down reflexive changes in autonomic state, the states become associated with thoughts and behaviors. This process is initiated through interception, and then bottom-up feelings of autonomic state are interpreted by higher brain structures, which in turn may initiate intentional behaviors. This linkage between feelings, example autonomic state, and behaviors and thoughts form the neurophysiological basis for aspects of associative learning. The premise of many therapeutic strategies is to separate the feelings from the associated thoughts and behaviors. Strategies that are polyvagal informed focus on enabling the client to experience the feelings without linking the feelings to thoughts or behaviors. Basically, the client learns that the feelings are not intentional or under voluntary control, but are part of the adaptive reflexive system that's wired into our nervous system. Thus, although attributes of the sequence are initially reflexive, these are effective portals to modify the association. For example, acknowledging the hierarchy of organization of the autonomic nervous system would suggest that the introduction of cues of safety would be a functional antidote to threat reactions by reducing the associative links between feelings of threat and thoughts and actions. These speculations are consistent with dissolution, a process in which cortical influence on regulating, example calming, autonomic state become less effective. Functionally, the repurposed neural system that emerged during the transition from ancient reptiles to early mammals allowed sociality to function as a neuromodulator, calming physiology and optimizing bodily functions. In addition to sociality, positive memories and visualizations associated with positive experiences enable humans to access positive feelings, example, autonomic state, to actively inhibit threat reactions. Access to sociality is a neuromodulator. It's influenced by both autonomic state and the flexibility of resilience that an individual's autonomic state has in returning from a state of threat to a state that supports homeostasis. We also learned that this accessibility is in part dependent on a personal history during which autonomic state may have been retuned to optimize defense. This is frequently observed in individuals with a severe adversity history, whose traumatic experiences have retuned the autonomic nervous system to be locked into states of defense. This is reported by foster parents of children. Children who've been abused and for safety concerns have been removed from their biological parents. Culturally and physiological influences divert interest in feelings of safety. Within our educational institutions, we have been acculturalized to accept the dictum coined by philosopher René Descartes that I think, therefore I am. This view has led to a cultural expectation that the rational mind defines us, and that the feelings distort this expectation and need to be constrained. Polyvagal theory provides an alternative perspective to that historical proposition. First, the theory would lead to a perspective that rather than thinking defining our existence, feeling does. Specifically, a revised polyvagal informed statement would suggest that I feel myself, therefore I am, and I frequently use this example in my talks, although I use the French and not the Latin presentation of the dictum. Reflexive verbs are more commonly used in French than in English. Reflexive verbs are actions that the subject is performing upon itself. Thus, using the reflexive form of the verb, to feel will unambiguously convey internal feelings and not the sensations of feelings touching an object. In English, when we use the word feel, it is ambiguous and may reflect either situation. By using je pense, je suis, it's easily rephrased, both the reflexive form of the verb to feel. The modified statement, je me sens donc je suis, emphasizes that I feel myself, I exist. The statement consistent with the current interest in embodiment and reports from trauma survivors of being disembodied and experiencing a bodily numbness. Descartes' philosophy led to a partitioning of human experience into separate domains dependent on mind, mental activities, and body, physical structure. Descartes proposed that mental states or processes cannot exist outside the body, and the body cannot think. The separation between mind and body, often labeled as Cartesian dualism, has been consistent with our contemporary cognitive-centric worldview that's mirrored in a corticocentric brain-body separation that dominates much of the medical and mental health treatment models. Descartes argued that rational decision-making can only be developed when judgments are based not on passion, bodily feelings. This dualism is still prevalent in current medical practices, especially when illness cannot be linked to a specific organ dysfunction. When objective clinical assessments of bodily fluids and/or tissues do not provide a positive clinical indicator leading to an understood disorder, physicians often assume that the disorder is psychiatric or psychosomatic, and the patient should get psychiatric consultation and care. According to Damasio in 1994, Descartes' perspective had a fatal error in not acknowledging the interaction of feelings, example the body, with the mental activities, example the brain. Consistent with the polyvagal theory, Damasio in 1994 emphasizes that bodily feeling can have a powerful influence on mental processes. Thus, rational thought, as espoused by Descartes, would be a special case of mental processing in which the autonomic nervous system is not disrupting cognitive function. Perhaps this special case is dependent on an autonomic state associated with feelings of safety. Concurrently, we also have been influenced by the concept of survival of the fittest. This concept was first introduced by Herbert Spencer in 1851. Spencer proposed that individuals' self-preservation is the most important moral principle. The term was then used by Charles Darwin in 1859 in On the Origin of Species. Darwin suggested that the organisms best adjusted in this environment were the most successful in surviving and reproducing. Over the decades, survival of the fittest has frequently been interpreted as the strongest and most aggressive, which would suggest the control of resources and access to mating partners could be an objective metric of fitness and eventually the product of natural selection. By the mid-20th century, a more integrated model emerged that began to reconcile the findings of genetics and inheritance with Darwin's theory and its emphasis on natural selection. The resolution was called the evolutionary synthesis, or modern synthesis, and one of its architects was Russian population geneticist Theodosis Dubansky. The key revelation was that mutation, by creating genetic diversity, supplied the raw material for natural selection to act on, instead of mutation and natural selection being alternative explanations. They were joined in this new synthesis. This synthesis led to an alternative perspective of fitness. Dubansky's insights led to the following frequently quoted statement, that the fittest may also be the gentlest, because survival often requires mutual help and cooperation. According to Dubansky, it's this capacity to cooperate that enabled the earliest mammalian species to survive in a hostile world dominated by physically larger and potentially aggressive reptiles. Dubansky's insightful statement converges on the emphasis of polyvagal theory on the phylogenetic transitions in neuroanatomy and neurophysiology as social mammals evolved from asocial reptiles. Mutual help and cooperation are dependent on a nervous system that has the capacity to down-regulate threat reactions, to allow the proximity necessary for cooperative behaviors and co-regulation. In mammals, this is neuroanatomically and neurophysiologically observed in the repurposed neural circuits originating in brainstem areas that regulate the autonomic nervous system. The repurposed system enables feelings of safety to co-occur with sociality.